The Jets could end up like the Browns. The Jets could end up like the Lions. It all depends on Aaron Glenn. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, July 9th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. On today's show, we have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag show with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's begin. Our first question. John, the 2021 Lions underwent a change in general manager, head coach, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, and quarterback after winning 5 games the year prior. They went 3-13-1. It took them until week 13 to win their first game that next season. The 2016 Browns also changed general manager, head coach, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, and quarterback in 2016 after winning 3 games the year before. They went 1-15. It took them until week 16 to win their first game that season. The Lions improved to 9-8 following the following season, while the Browns infamously went 0-16 in 2017. Given the history above, where the Jets are in very rare air, undergoing an entire front office and coaching staff change, along with a quarterback change in the same offseason, should Jets fans expect this to be a rebuilding year where 4 wins could be considered a success? Furthermore, picking between these 2 previous examples, which path do you think the 2026 Jets follow? The futility of the 2017 Browns or the ascension of the 2022 Lions, and why? So very detailed question. So what it comes down to, Jets made a lot of wholesale changes. Jets changed their GM, Jets changed their head coach, Jets changed both coordinators, Jets changed quarterbacks. You usually don't see that much change in the NFL. So these are 2 distinct examples. You had the Detroit Lions in 2021, you have the Cleveland Browns in 2016. Both teams struggled year 1 under the new regime. In year 2, Lions improved, Browns got worse. So which of these 2 paths will the Jets follow? Now, I think the easy answer for anyone following the Jets is they are in many ways trying to model themselves after the Detroit Lions, because they brought in Aaron Glenn, who was the Lions defensive coordinator, part of that new regime in Detroit that took over in 2021 and struggled that first year. And then 2022 started to improve, and 2023, became a contender. Everybody wants to avoid the Browns scenario where, they go on to win 1 game and over the span of 2 seasons. I don't think that year 1 should be quite as bad for the Jets as year 1 was for Detroit or for Cleveland, because I think the Jets are further along than both of those teams. Jets won 5 games last year. If we're being honest, they were a little unlucky to not be like a 7-win team. That was really kind of like a 7-win team masquerading as a 5-win team. So I don't think that's, I don't think the Jets are going to fall as far. And the other thing is, like, there's a base of talent on the roster. You have Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson, your 2 like premium players. But beyond that, there are a lot of quality starters on this Jets team. You want to talk about the linebackers, Damian Sherwood and Quincy Williams. Another star up front in the defensive line, Quinnen Williams, along with 2 really good players, Jermaine Johnson and Will McDonald. The offensive line, you have Joe Tippmann and AVT. You've got Olu Fashanu, who had a strong finish to the season. We're going to hope Armand Membu is that good. So there's a base of talent here. And if we're being honest, the Jets lost a lot of guys who used to be big names, but I don't think they really lost anybody outside of maybe Devontae Adams, who was helping the team last year. Aaron Rodgers, obviously one of the greatest quarterbacks who's ever lived. I don't know if the Jets really downgraded going to Justin Fields, though. Mike Williams, Hassan Reddick, Tyron Smith, these are guys who have been great players in the NFL in the past, but they didn't really contribute much to the Jets last year. So outside of Devontae Adams, I don't think there was a guy who went out the door who was really helping the team. So, and I understand, you can't always extrapolate, this team won 5 games last year. Think about how much better it'll be this year, because that's what we did a year ago. We did the whole thing with, they won 7 games with Zach Wilson. Imagine how many they'll win with Aaron Rodgers. It doesn't always go that way, but I don't see this team getting worse. Anything can happen. Of course, injuries can pile up. But the other aspect of this is the coaching almost has to be better. And again, I know that's an easy thing to say. I know every team with a new coaching staff thinks that their coaching is automatically going to get better from the staff that got fired. But in this case, you didn't really have a head coach because you had Jeff Ulbrich for 3/4 of the season, who wasn't really a head coach. It was kind of split between being the head coach and the defensive coordinator. And then on the offensive side of the ball, you had the Nathaniel Hackett, Todd Downing duo. And, it's not to say Aaron Glenn's guaranteed to be great, but it's difficult to conceive of a scenario where Aaron Glenn's worse than Jeff Ulbrich. And Tanner Engstrand may not be great. It's difficult to conceive of a scenario where he's worse than Nathaniel Hackett. And, Todd Downing was a little bit better than Hackett, but Todd Downing really wasn't that great. So I think the Jets are a little further along because you remember the Lions, when they brought in Dan Campbell and that coaching staff, they traded their quarterback, Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford was still playing at a high level, so they downgraded at quarterback. And the Browns were just like in the middle of an era where they had nothing going for them. The Browns were at a roster point akin to like where the Jets were when Mike McCagnon and Adam Gase were here, where there was really no talent at all on the roster. So I don't think next year is going to be as bleak for the Jets. I don't think 2025 is going to be as bleak. Now, after 2025, is it more likely they ascend like the Lions, or they fall apart, or they continue to fall apart like the Browns? The reality is the most likely situation is somewhere between these two extremes. The Lions are not a typical case, and the Browns are not a typical case. You'd like to think that it's more likely they turn into the Browns. It's difficult to say right now because we don't know how good Aaron Glenn's going to be. All we can really judge Aaron Glenn on right now, before a coach ever takes the field for a game, really the only thing you can judge him on is the question: are there any red flags? I don't see any red flags from the way Aaron Glenn handled the first offseason. I think everything was handled more or less the way it should be. I think the team made the right decision moving on from Rodgers. I think that the team made the right decision playing cautiously in free agency and, kind of just setting 2025 up as a transitional year where they're going to try their hardest to compete, but, not adding to the cap woes. For example, as a contrast to this, when Adam Gase took over that first offseason, there were red flags all over the place. The moves the Jets were making, the fact that Adam Gase was able to get the general manager fired, the fact that Adam Gase wasn't really a good coach. In fact, he brought in Dowell Loggins as his offensive coordinator. I mean, and there were more. There were a million red flags when Adam Gase came in that first offseason. I haven't seen any red flags with Aaron Glenn. So the hope has to be that, this is the regime that turns things around. Of course, the wild card's always going to be the owner. We don't have a good owner. And beyond not having a good owner, we have a guy who you never know when he's going to step in and make things worse. We can hope that maybe his new venture with soccer in the United Kingdom will leave him a little distracted. And you just hope that these guys are the right duo, and ultimately it's going to come down to the quality of Aaron Glenn and Darren Mucci. What's the biggest contrast between that Detroit team and that Cleveland team? The question mentioned, the Lions hired Dan Campbell, who's an excellent head coach. The Browns hired Hugh Jackson, who is one of the worst head coaches in recent NFL history. Hugh Jackson's a very good assistant coach, but he was clearly in over his head as a head coach. And with a first-time head coach, Aaron Glenn, who comes to Detroit, he was their defensive coordinator. We don't, it's difficult to say like whether or not how good he's going to be. But I do get the feeling like he's trying to kind of replicate the Dan Campbell coaching style. You have some guys who come in and they want to be, they want to run their side of the ball. They want to run their offense or their defense. Dan Campbell's not really a scheme guy. Dan Campbell's more of a CEO type head coach, a guy who kind of oversees everything, tries to hire good people, gives them direction, supervises them. If something doesn't look right, he'll step in, but is not a guy who's heavy-handed on offense or defense. I get the feeling, the feeling I've gotten early is that although Aaron Glenn obviously comes with a defensive background, he wants to be more of a CEO style coach. And I think, hiring Steve Wilks as your defensive coordinator is a sign of that. Steve Wilks is a former head coach in this league. He's a guy with a pretty big profile, guy who was the coordinator on a Super Bowl team in San Francisco 2 years ago. I think if you bring in a coordinator with that type of pedigree, it's a sign you want to be a CEO style head coach. So Glenn, I think, is in many ways modeling himself after Dan Campbell. How successful he is, I don't know, but I'm going to be optimistic and say it's more likely the Jets follow the Detroit path than the Cleveland path. Now, on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's play over-under for the Jets in 2025. We've talked about long-term, but what's the prognosis for this year? We'll dive into it as we continue here on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Summer sports are in full swing, and whether you're all about baseball under the lights, golf under the green, or high-stakes soccer action, FanDuel is the best way to make every game more exciting. You're already following the action. Why not make it a little more thrilling? With FanDuel, you can get in on the game while your friends are getting sunburned on the beach. Of course, we got baseball, we got golf, we've got soccer, and you could also look ahead to the NFL season. FanDuel, not giving the Jets much respect, a 5.5 win over under. If you believe in the Jets or you believe anything else happening on the sports scene this summer, again, FanDuel is the place to be. Are you new to FanDuel? Well, new customers can bet just $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. Open the FanDuel app today or visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We're in a summer schedule right now, but next week we'll be back full time, 5 days a week, with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as big news breaks. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. Our next question comes from Dan. Which would you bet on if given the choice? Jets under 2.5 wins or Jets over 9.5 wins? To put it in a different way, what's more likely? The Jets get the number 1 overall pick or the Jets make the playoffs? So I would be surprised if the Jets got over 9.5 wins, but I would be floored if the Jets got under 2.5 wins. I think the base case, I think the most likely scenario is somewhere between the two. If you're asking me right now, I guess this is probably somewhere around like a 7-10 football team, but the path from 7-10 to 10-7 is not that great. I mean, it might just be a couple bounces in close games. Last year the Jets were 3-7 in tight games, and your record year to year in tight games tends to kind of fluctuate. So the Jets get a few bounces. Maybe the next thing I'm about to say might be a lot to ask. Maybe a blown call goes the Jets' way in a key spot for once. That might be a lot to ask, but it could happen. Maybe the schedule is a little softer than we expected it to be. Maybe some of the teams you're playing suffer a key injury at an inopportune time. And then coaching can make a difference. I mean, a number of the games last year, a better coaching decision here or there could have swung it. Special teams could make a difference. You hope that the Jets' new special teams coach, Chris Banjo, who is a disciple of the great Mike Westhoff, maybe he can get the Jets' special teams back into gear. Brant Boyer was an excellent special teams coach, but Jets kind of struggled on special teams last year. I mean, these are the things that swing tight games. And ultimately, like the difference between a 7-10 team and a 10-7 team, it's really not that big. Whereas, I really can't envision, unless this is just a season where the Jets get decimated by injuries. It's really difficult for me to see a scenario where the Jets end up with the number 1 overall pick in the draft. And it goes back to the talent we're talking about. And I think a lot of the reason people are down on the Jets, it isn't about the roster. It's about the sense that, nothing can go right for this franchise. It's the sense that we have a 14-year playoff drought. It's the sense that last year and the last 2 years, the Jets were talked up as Super Bowl contenders, and the seasons fell apart both years. But ultimately, if you look at this roster, it's not horrible. I mean, it's not a great roster. It's not a Super Bowl roster, and it wasn't a Super Bowl roster last year. It's not a Super Bowl roster this year, but it's not a worst team in the league type roster. And, this goes back to, something we talk a lot about Joe Douglas on the show, the Jets' old GM, and how he's a guy who is kind of in some circles really overrated, and then in some circles underrated. Some people will tell you he was a great GM. My dad actually loves Joe Douglas. He keeps talking about how Joe Douglas was a great GM, and I don't agree with my dad on that. But then you talk to other people, you think he was the worst GM in the league. And I kind of think it's somewhere in between, where he made a lot of mistakes. There were he was bad in free agency. He was not good after the second round of the draft. He was really bad managing the salary cap. But there were also some really good moves he made along the way. Especially if you look at his record the first 2 rounds of the draft, there were some big misses at key positions, Mekhi Becton and Zach Wilson. But the first 2 rounds of the draft under Joe Douglas in 5 years produced Garrett Wilson, Sauce Gardner, Jermaine Johnson, Breece Hall. I was thinking the Jamal Adams trade, Elijah Vera Tucker, Joe Tittman, Will McDonald. I'll throw Olu Fashanu in the mix because I really believe in Olu Fashanu. There were lots of the talent base improved. And what I will say for Joe Douglas is he was really the first Jets GM since Parcells who left the team in better shape than he found it. I talked a bit about this yesterday, where there were GMs like Tannenbaum who inherited a team that was not in great shape, really improved it, but then on his watch, it fell apart. Yeah, but I don't think that since Bill Parcells, the Jets have had a GM since Joe Douglas is the first Jets GM since Bill Parcells, who actually, like, you look at the roster he inherited and the roster he left behind, it's better. It was, Joe Douglas wasn't as good as he was cracked up to be, but the team actually has a base of talent of players entering their prime now, and that's a credit to Joe Douglas. And that's the type of thing that makes it different from when John Idzik was here, when Mike McCagnon was here, or when Joe Douglas first took over. I think we're used to the Jets being bad for so long that we just assume that, like, they're one of the worst teams in the league, that they have one of the worst rosters in the league. And that's not the case anymore. I think they stopped building around that roster in 2023 and tried to kind of like cut corners to get to the Super Bowl. The good news, though, is that most of the players are here, and including a player I'm surprised is still here. I really was expecting Jamie Sherwood to leave in free agency. I didn't think the Jets would move on from CJ Mosley, and Mosley, great guy in the locker room, a very good player, but it was time to move on. It was time to like embrace a young player, Jamie Sherwood, and I was delighted when the Jets were able to keep Jamie Sherwood by locking him up on a long-term deal. But I think that there's enough talent there that with a little luck, we might be able to get to 10 wins. I'm not predicting it. I think we're probably going to fall short, but I see a path to 10 wins. I don't see a path to 2 outside of the Jets just getting decimated by injuries in a way you can't predict. I really don't see how this team's going to win 2 games. I try not to pump you up too much. The last couple of years, like, I've tried to be optimistic, but I've also kind of given you the warnings. I kind of gave you the warnings about how the Rodgers thing may not work out. But man, 2 wins, I just don't see that. Next question, John. Quincy Williams is in the last year of his contract. Do you think the Jets should try and extend him? I do. I'm a big believer in keeping your own guys who are good players. And I think the 2 arguments against I think there are 3 arguments against it, actually. I think number one is he hasn't performed yet in Aaron Glenn's system. And Jets gave Jamie Sherwood a contract, but the reason the Jets gave Jamie Sherwood a contract was that he was a free agent. They either had to pay him or let him go. So they didn't get a chance to see him in Aaron Glenn's system. The second argument against it is, they did give Sherwood that contract. Do you want to lock up that much money at linebacker, which is not a high value position? And the third argument against it is, Quincy Williams is kind of pushing 30. I'm sympathetic to these arguments, but I think Quincy Williams is going to have a good year. I mean, I think in Aaron Glenn's defense, where he's blitzing off the edge, he's going to fire with all that speed off the edge. I think he could be a 5 to 6 sack guy this year. That's my bold prediction for this episode. Quincy Williams 5 to 6 sacks. Do you want to tie that much money up in the linebacker position? I think that you invest where you're good at. I think that being good at linebacker means you don't have to be as good at other spots. So I don't really have an issue with that. If that's where your good players are, that's where you invest. And, you always worry about a guy who's approaching 30, but, I get the feeling Quincy's going to age gracefully. One of the things I always ask is, like, is this guy's skill set something that will age well? I think Quincy's will age well. A couple of years ago, I may not have said that. When he first got to the Jets, he was a guy who had a lot of speed, but was kind of out of control frequently. But I think over the last couple of years, the game's kind of slowed down for him. The guy who's in the right spot, he uses that speed effectively now. He knows where to be. He takes good angles to the ball. So I think that his game is going to age well. And I don't think the speed's going to go away overnight. I think it'll be a more gradual thing. So he's a guy I would roll the dice on keeping. And linebacker, DJ Reed was a guy who I had concerns with because cornerback is a position where you really do have to be athletic. Linebacker is a more instinctual position. Of course, speed helps and you can't be really slow. But linebacker is more a position about being in the right place than it is about pure athleticism. So I would have no issue with the Jets keeping Quincy around for a couple more years. I think he's got one more contract in him to effective play. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's go down the road not taken. Of course, a couple of years ago, they had a lot of really talented young players, and then things kind of fell apart. We're going to look back and take a look at a road the Jets could have taken and a road they can still take ahead here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question comes from Taylor, who writes, "Hey, John, you've talked a lot about how the Jets had solid momentum after the 2022 season. This was before Woody Johnson turned it into the Aaron Rodgers show, and I completely agree with you. However, I also understand the team's desperation at quarterback, given that Zach Wilson was clearly a disaster. What do you think they should have done differently during that offseason?" Well, when I go back there, I don't think the problem was trading for Aaron Rodgers necessarily. I think it was the way they did it, because the way the Jets acted, it was essentially that, like, we're going Aaron Rodgers at any price, at any cost is worth it. And as long as we get Aaron Rodgers, we're now a Super Bowl team. And it was almost like at the first sign of the Jets not being the worst team in the league, they decided they were Super Bowl contenders. I think the Jets also ignored some pretty clear warning signs about Rodgers. I mean, you go back to that 2022 season, his last year in Green Bay, it was not a great season for Rodgers. It was the worst season of his career at that point. And he was 39 years old. And that's the point where you have to wonder, people just kind of explained it away. He lost Devontae Adams. His receivers weren't that good. He was playing with an injury to his hand. And yeah, maybe that was possible, but it's also possible a guy at 39 who's had his worst season, maybe that's a little sign of decline. I think the way that if they were going to go after Rodgers, they should have made it clear, look, we're building around this core. We want you to be the quarterback. We hope you can take us to new heights, but we're not going to bring in like anybody you want at wide receiver. We're not going to bring in your offensive coordinator. And another key thing that gets forgot about that offseason is that trade took so long to complete because, first of all, Rodgers had to decide he was coming to the Jets. Then the Jets had to work out a trade. The Jets should have set a hard deadline for both Rodgers deciding and for a trade with Green Bay, because Packers had to trade Rodgers, and the Jets were the only team interested. So if Rodgers wanted to continue his career, it had to be with the Jets. If the Packers wanted to trade Rodgers, it had to be to the Jets. The Jets had, the word of the year in 2023. The Jets had the leverage, but they let it slip because the Jets just made a decision that we had to have Rodgers no matter what. And they should have set a firm date for both Rodgers making his decision and for making a trade with the Packers, because that offseason, the Jets were limited in what they could do because they didn't complete the trade. And we know of at least one big free agent that year who kind of turned away from the Jets. And there's one major free agent who's on record who said, you know what, I didn't even consider the Jets because the Rodgers trade wasn't done. And beyond that, the Jets did not know how much Rodgers would cost against the cap. So it was difficult to dive in and make moves. So the biggest problem for the Jets that year is they weren't willing to walk away from the deal. And whenever you're not willing to walk away from a deal, you put yourself in trouble. And it comes to a certain point where you got to move on to plan B. I think the Jets, as they frequently do, they got caught up in the idea of winning the offseason, getting all the praise on the back pages and sports talk radio and, ESPN and the cable NFL, all the cable stations, NFL Network. And they stopped thinking about building a good football team. They should have. There's nothing wrong with Rodgers being their plan A. I mean, I think if you look at the options that offseason, rolling the dice on Rodgers was probably the one that was the most logical. But the way they did it just made Rodgers like the center of the universe. If you're going to bring in Rodgers, it had to be clear that, you're the quarterback, you're not the GM, you're not the coach. And the Packers, hey, you know what? If we don't make a trade by this date, enjoy Rodgers. You're not going to be able to play Jordan Love this year. You're going to have to move on from Jordan Love. And failing that, the Jets should have understood. The thing that was the most illogical to me about the way the Jets handled the last 2 years is they acted like they were up against the clock. When the Rams traded for Matthew Stafford, they were kind of stalled out. They were a playoff team, but they couldn't, they were clearly in the second tier of the NFC. Aaron Donald was getting older. Jalen Ramsey wasn't super old, but he was nearing the end of his prime. A lot of their key players were it was kind of now or never with those guys. With the Jets, all their good players were young, so they had plenty of time to build this thing slowly, build through the draft. And, it would not have been a popular move, but going out and getting a Jacoby Brissett who would play at a higher level than Zach Wilson, may have been enough. Because I think if Jacoby Brissett was the Jets quarterback in 2022, they probably would have made the playoffs with that defense. And with Brees, and with Brees Hall coming back in 2023, the team would have been in better shape. It's the problem with the Rodgers trade is ultimately the cost was more than what they gave up for Rodgers. They didn't just give up 2 second-round picks for Rodgers and a pick swap in the first round. They gave up all the money they signed Allen Lazard with. They gave up the third-round pick that they sent out for Devontae Adams. They gave up another third-round pick for Hassan Reddick, a deal that they probably would not have made had Rodgers not been here. And they were chasing this. The money that went for Mike Williams, the money that went for Tyron Smith, there were so many resources, even the $3 million for Randall Cobb. The Rodgers trade ended up having this compounding cost. And I'm not just saying it's not just Jacoby Brissett versus Aaron Rodgers, Jacoby Brissett plus the team you could have built up around them. And then maybe you pick a quarterback over one of the last 2 years. And then maybe you got your guy and we're ready to contend for, 5-6 years. So the Jets should have been more cautious. Look, in fairness, at the time, I was a big proponent of signing Derek Carr, and looking back, I think that also would have been a mistake. Even beyond, nobody could have predicted Carr would suffer a career-ending injury with the Saints. But I don't think he was that great the last 2 years, and I think he would have cost the Jets a lot of money. I think that move would not have been a good one. I think they should have gone more of a stopgap. The veteran who's unexciting, guy who's not going to make a lot of plays, but will at least know where to get the ball when the first read's open. The guy who will avoid the big mistake. I think that's the direction the Jets should have gone, and they should have kept that young core as the most important part of the team. I think that's really where the Jets erred over the last 2 years. Next question, John, who's an underrated player on offense and defense who could break out this season? On offense, I'm really interested in what Braylon Allen could do because he was so up and down last year. Like the first month of the season, it felt like the Jets had a really quality back in Braylon Allen, a guy who could catch the ball out of the backfield, a guy who you could leave on the field on passing downs because he was the guy who could catch the football. And then I don't know what happened. Like he really struggled like the last 3 quarters of the season. I think he only in like the last 12 weeks or so, he only had like one game where he averaged 4 yards per carry, and you can blame the offensive line. But first of all, Breece Hall did better in that stretch. Second of all, Braylon Allen's supposed to be a guy who can lower his shoulder and grind out yardage. But maybe year 2 things will be more consistent for him. He's obviously a guy who can be good. On defense, I'm going Andre Cisco. I think this is a defense where Andre Cisco could thrive. Last year with Jacksonville, he was benched, but Jacksonville had kind of like a similar season to the Jets where things just fell apart. And I feel like on the Jets, there were lots of guys who kind of got dragged down by like the overall dysfunction of the team. And I think like in Jacksonville, there are probably similar cases because the 2 years prior to that, Cisco was a very good free safety. And the big part of this defense is the Jets are going to blitz a lot. They're going to try and force errant throws. And you'll have Andre Cisco, who's got good instincts in the back of the defense there to try and like pick those passes off. I mean, I could see Andre Cisco being like a 4 interception guy this season in this defense, if not more. And I have to say, of the signings the Jets made this offseason, that's the one that I really like. That's the one I'll stick my neck out for and say that was a good signing. And hopefully he'll prove me right. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back next time to talk more Jets.